The stars outside the viewport did not move. They never moved. But today, everything else was dying. Captain Elias Vorn stood alone on the forward deck of the UES Vindicator, watching the holographic battlefield projection fracture in real time. One moment, it was a structured war grid, clean vectors, controlled formations, allied fleets holding the line. Now it was chaos. Red markers expanded like an infection across the outer sectors. Blue markers, alliance vessels, blinked, flickered, and vanished one after another as if someone was erasing them from existence. No explosions. No warnings. Just disappearance. A cold voice from the tactical AI filled the silence. Outer Fleet Group Sigma has ceased transmission. A pause. Outer Fleet Group Karen has ceased transmission. Another pause. Then the line that made the entire bridge go quiet. Strategic Defense Corridor collapsed. Enemy advance velocity increased by 41%. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all understood what that meant. The war wasn't being lost. It was already over in the outer systems. Lieutenant Mara Keel stood near the command console, her hands hovering above the data interface but not touching it. As if she was afraid the moment she acknowledged reality, it would become irreversible. "It's not possible," she whispered finally. "The Bravax formation shouldn't be able to break through Sector 9 this fast. We built 3 defensive layers there." Captain Vorn didn't look away from the projection. "We did," he said quietly. "That's what makes this interesting." Interesting. The word felt wrong in the room. Outside the ship, distant flashes of light pulsed across the void, entire fleets dying beyond visual range. Each flash represented thousands of lives compressed into a single silent moment of deletion. On the far edge of the holographic map, the Heron perimeter line flickered amber. Then red. Then gone. A junior officer swallowed hard. "Sir, the Allied command is requesting immediate withdrawal of all remaining ships to inner defensive systems." Mara turned sharply. "Withdrawal? We still have fleets stationed at Kelvara Passage. If we pull back now, we lose the entire outer buffer zone." The officer didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was already in the data stream behind him. Because Kelvara Passage was already gone. Captain Vorn finally turned away from the map. His face looked calm, but it wasn't calmness, it was the expression of someone who had already walked through the worst possible outcome in their mind and found no alternate exit. "How long?" he asked. No one needed to ask what he meant. The tactical AI responded instantly. "At current Bravax expansion rate, inner system breach probability exceeds 78% within 9 standard cycles." Silence dropped again. 9 cycles. Less than a week. The Bravax Dominion had not just broken the outer line. They had erased it so completely that there was no evidence it had ever held. Commander Jalen Rusk entered, still wearing partial tactical armor, like he hadn't slept in 2 cycles. His eyes went straight to the map. "So it's true," he said. No greeting. No preamble. Just confirmation of collapse. Vorn nodded once. Rusk exhaled sharply. "Outer Command is pulling every fleet back to Sigma 4. Even the reserve battle groups." "Yes." Rusk looked at the 14 human ships on the map. Then back at Vorn. "And they're still out there." A pause. "Why?" Mara answered before Vorn could. "Because they were told to hold." Rusk frowned. "And when Command withdrew? They weren't recalled." That landed differently in the room. Not as strategy. As omission. As absence where instruction should have been. Rusk looked back at Vorn. "So what's the official position?" Vorn didn't hesitate. "Officially," he said. "They are fulfilling their assigned delay operation." "And unofficially?" Silence stretched for a moment. Then Vorn said it. "Unofficially, they are alone." That word changed the air in the room. Alone. Not just outnumbered. Not just unsupported. Removed from the system that defined survival as something coordinated. Rusk stepped closer to the display. 14 ships against a Dominion expansion fleet, they'll be vaporized before reinforcements even stabilize at Sigma 4. Mara looked at him sharply. "Reinforcements aren't going back out." Rusk nodded slowly. "I know." No one spoke for a moment. Then the tactical AI added another update no one asked for. Civilian evacuation success probability in outer colony chain, 41% and decreasing. Mara whispered, almost to herself. "They're not just losing the war," she said. "They're choosing what gets erased first." Vorn looked at the map again. At the shrinking perimeter. At the collapsing lines of defense. At the 14 small human markers still holding a position that no longer made sense in any strategic framework. And for the first time, something shifted behind his eyes. Not rebellion. Not hope. Recognition of something the system could not calculate. "They're not supposed to survive," he said quietly. Rusk glanced at him. No one is. But Vorn didn't look away from the map. They're not behaving like a delay unit, he continued. Mara frowned. What do you mean? He paused. Then said, they haven't moved a beat. No retreat vectors. No fallback oscillations. No dispersion patterns. Rusk shook his head. They're holding position because they're waiting for orders. Vorn's voice dropped slightly. No, he said. They're holding because they decided to. That statement didn't belong in the room. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't procedural. It wasn't even allowed inside doctrine. Rusk looked at him. That's not sustainable. Vorn nodded slowly. I know. A long silence followed. Outside the ship, somewhere far beyond sight, entire fleets were folding inward towards safety lines that no longer included the outer worlds. And still, 14 ships remained in place. A quiet contradiction at the edge of a collapsing empire. Mara finally spoke again, softer now. If they stay, she said, they're not buying time anymore. Vorn finished the thought. They're becoming the line. No one corrected him. Because for the first time since the war began, the map didn't look like a retreat. It looked like a decision someone had made without permission. And somewhere in that realization, the shape of the story changed. The council chamber aboard the line command vessel Ardent Spire was designed for agreement. That was its problem. Every surface curved gently inward, as if the room itself expected all decisions to eventually converge into a single acceptable answer. The lighting was soft, the acoustics dampened conflict, and the central table displayed data in calm, color-coded symmetry. Nothing about it was built for disagreement. Captain Elias Vorn stood at the edge of that symmetry and broke it anyway. The room was already full. The Line High Admiral Sorrel Vane stood at the center, pale-skinned and motionless, his secondary eyelids flickering occasionally as data streamed through his neural interface. To his right, Sarthi Marshal Kor Vela remained upright, arms folded in disciplined stillness. At the far end, Dronikai tactical observers sat in silence, their bioluminescent patterns dimmed into subdued grief tones. And above the table, the war map of the Heron Shelf. Now shrinking. Now collapsing inward. Now abandoning itself. Vane spoke first, voice translated into flat human speech through a precision vocal matrix. The Unified Accord has completed strategic withdrawal execution orders. Remaining outer formations are to disengage within 5.2 cycles. He paused. This is not a debate. It was meant to end the room. Instead, it opened it. Captain Vorn stepped forward. That single movement changed the temperature of the chamber. Mara Keel stood just behind him, her posture rigid, like she was already preparing for impact rather than argument. Vane's secondary eyelids flickered once. Captain Harmon, the Admiral said carefully, your presence was requested for procedural confirmation only. Vorn nodded once. I understand. Then he added, I am not here to confirm withdrawal. Silence. It didn't fall. It was created. Just holding. And for the first time in the war? Someone inside the system had begun to wonder if that difference mattered. The war room aboard the UES Vindicator was not built for inspiration. It was built for failure analysis. Every surface was modular, replaceable, and scarred by prior engagements. The lighting was harsh enough to eliminate ambiguity. The holographic table in the center flickered slightly from residual power strain, like even the ship systems were tired of what it was being shown. Captain Elias Vorn stood at its edge. But this time, he was not alone. The room was full. And for the first time since the withdrawal order, no one looked like they were waiting for permission to exist. Lieutenant Mara Keel stood near tactical input, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the shifting debris field projection. Chief Engineer Dax Rel leaned against a bulkhead, already tapping calculations into a handheld slate. Weapons Officer Priyakes had 3 separate targeting overlays open at once, each one unstable and evolving in real time. And at the back, pilots, engineers, tactical analysts, field officers. Not a council. Not a command delegation. A working system. Vorn looked at them all. Then he said the words that changed everything. We are not withdrawing. No one reacted immediately. Because they were past surprise. Past permission. Past shock. Mara exhaled slowly. That's not a statement, she said. That's a decision that already happened. Vorn nodded once. Yes. He tapped the holographic table. The display zoomed in. Not on the entire war front. Not on the collapsing Accord perimeter. Not on the retreat lanes. Only the Heron Shelf debris corridor. A chaotic, broken field of wreckage, collapsed stations, drifting hull fragments, ionized dust clouds, and unstable sensor interference zones left behind by earlier battles. A dead zone. A graveyard. And now, a trap. Priya tilted her head. You're focusing on the shelf. I am, Vorn said. Daxrel frowned. That region is a navigation nightmare. Sensors fail every 11 to 17 seconds depending on drift density. You can't maintain coordinated fleet movement there under combat conditions. Vorn looked at him. That's why we're going to fight there. Silence. Not confusion. Recognition forming slowly. Mara stepped forward slightly. That's where the Bravax advance is coming through. Yes, Vorn said. They'll take the corridor, she continued, because it's the shortest vector to inner systems. Yes. And they assume nothing significant is left in it. Yes. Priya's eyes narrowed. Because the Accord withdrew. Vorn nodded again. And because we were told to leave. That word again. Told. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Directed. Daxrel pushed off the bulkhead. You're suggesting we use the debris field as cover. No, Vorn said. He paused. Then corrected himself. We are suggesting the debris field is the weapon. That changed the tone in the room. Now it wasn't theory. It was structure. Priya stepped closer to the holographic map, rotating it with a sharp gesture. The Bravax formation enters through the upper vector lanes. They compress into formation density when crossing unstable terrain to maintain fire discipline. Yes, Vorn said. They rely on predictable spacing, she continued. Yes. Mara's eyes sharpened. And the shelf breaks predictability. Vorn nodded. It forces them to adapt. Daxrel frowned. But adaptation is not enough. We are still talking about 14 ships against a Dominion expansion fleet that outnumbers us. Doesn't matter, Priya cut in immediately. All eyes turned to her. She didn't look away from the map. It doesn't matter how many ships they have, she said. It matters how many can actually fire at once in that environment. Silence. Then she zoomed in. Overlaying firing arcs. Collision vectors. Sensor blind zones. Interference shadows. For the first time, the war room wasn't seeing numbers. It was seeing geometry. And geometry did something numbers could not. It created limits. Priya continued, voice sharpening as she built it in real time. In open space, they overwhelm us instantly. But in the shelf, they lose formation coherence. Their capital ships can't rotate fast enough through debris clusters. Their mid-tier escorts can't maintain synchronized firing lanes. She paused. Then added. They become segmented. Mara understood instantly. Fragmented targets. Yes. Daxrel stepped closer. That still doesn't solve survival probability. Priya looked at him. We're not solving survival, she said. That line landed heavy. Vorn nodded once. We are solving time. Silence again. But now it was different. Not doubt. Focus. Mara looked at the projection. How long? Vorn didn't answer immediately. He looked at Priya. She ran calculations silently. Then spoke. If executed correctly, she said, we can disrupt their advance corridor for 18 to 26 hours. Daxrel laughed once, short and disbelieving. 14 ships delaying a Dominion fleet for a full cycle? That's not a strategy, that's mythology. Priya didn't respond to that. Because she didn't need to. Vorn did. It already is mythology, he said quietly. The room went still again. He stepped closer to the table. And this time, his voice changed. Not louder. Not emotional. Just clearer. They believe the withdrawal means the end of resistance, he said. They will enter the shelf expecting cleanup operations. Mara nodded slowly. And instead they enter a kill zone. Yes, Vorn said. Daxrel frowned. Kill zone assumes we can kill them. Priya answered immediately. We don't need to kill them. Another pause. We need to slow them down. That was the shift. Not destruction. Delay architecture. Mara stared at the map. You're building a choke point doctrine. Priya corrected her. We're building a denial field. Vorn nodded. Exactly. Daxrel exhaled sharply. With 14 ships. Yes. And no reinforcements. Yes. And no fallback. Yes. Mara finally said it out loud. This is a suicide strategy. Silence followed. Long enough that it mattered. Then Vorn spoke. No, he said. He looked at all of them. This is a refusal strategy. That word again. Refusal. But now it had shape. Structure. Engineering. Priya zoomed out the map. 14 human markers. Spread across the debris field. Not clustered. Not centralized. Distributed. Intentional asymmetry. Each ship becomes a node, she said. Independent strike behavior. Overlapping fields of fire. Interference-based movement prediction denial. Daxrel blinked slowly. You're turning fleet coordination into distributed chaos warfare. Priya nodded once. Yes. Mara looked at Vorn. Who designed this? Vorn didn't answer immediately. Then he said, we did. That wasn't entirely true. But it also wasn't entirely false. Because it wasn't designed by command structure. It was designed by necessity. By engineers who refused to sleep. By pilots who learned to fly in broken patterns. By commanders who ignored doctrine long enough to survive beyond it. Vorn turned to the tactical interface. Show Bravac's advanced projection. The hologram updated. A massive moving formation. Structured. Disciplined. Inevitable. Then he overlaid the debris field. The shelf. The graveyard. And the gap where 14 ships waited. The system hesitated. For the first time, the simulation model showed instability. Mara noticed immediately. It's recalculating uncertainty margins. Priya nodded. Because it can't model human behavior in constrained chaos zones accurately. Daxrel stared at the projection. That shouldn't be possible. Vorn answered quietly. And yet it is happening. Silence settled again. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was charged. Like a system just before activation. Mara finally spoke. When do we deploy? Vorn didn't hesitate. Now. Priya nodded immediately. We need repositioning within 3 cycles to establish field overlap zones. Daxrel straightened. Engine modifications? Already in progress, Priya said. He looked at her sharply. She didn't smile. We started preparing when the withdrawal order was issued, she said. Mara exhaled slowly. So this wasn't a reaction. Vorn shook his head. No. He looked at the map one final time. This was always the only option that didn't assume we were already gone. Outside the ship, the stars remained cold and indifferent. But inside the war room, something had shifted. Not hope. Not certainty. Something more dangerous. Direction. And for the first time since the collapse began, 14 ships were no longer just surviving the war. They were about to define where it happened. The Heron Shelf looked like the aftermath of a forgotten god's war. Broken hulls drifted in slow silence. Mining stations hung in fractured orbit, their cores long dead but still glowing faintly with residual heat. Clouds of metallic dust stretched across thousands of kilometers, distorting sensors and bending long-range scans into unreliable ghosts. It was not empty space. It was corrupted space. And that was exactly why Captain Elias Vorn chose it. On the bridge of the UES Vindicator, the tactical projection hovered like a living storm. Lieutenant Mara Keel studied it closely. Breath advance confirmation just entered outer corridor threshold, she said. Scouts report minimal resistance signatures. Priya Kess leaned forward slightly. They're committing the forward strike group. Daxrel frowned. How many ships? Mara checked the feed. 32 confirmed Vanguard vessels. Heavy escort composition. No full formation deployment. Priya exhaled slowly. They think it's cleanup. That was the key word. Cleanup. Not battle. Not resistance. Erasure. Captain Vorn didn't take his eyes off the map. They are behaving exactly as expected, he said. Mara looked at him. They didn't detect us? They detected debris, Priya corrected. Not intent. Daxrel crossed his arms. That's because we haven't broadcast any coherent fleet signature. Vorn nodded once. Correct. He zoomed the holographic projection inward. 14 human ships. Spread across the shelf like fractures in a broken mirror. Not in formation. Not in defensive clustering. But distributed across the debris field in carefully calculated asymmetry. Each ship positioned within a zone of sensor interference overlap. Each firing arc designed to cross into blind space created by wreckage drift. Each escape vector intentionally incomplete. Mara studied it closely. We're invisible. Priya shook her head. Not invisible. Uninterpretable. Daxrel frowned. That's not a tactical term. It is now, she said. Vorn finally spoke. They expect remnants, he said. Stragglers. Survivors running without coordination. Mara nodded. That's why they only sent the Vanguard. Exactly, Vorn said. They believe they are closing a retreat. A pause. Then Priya added quietly. They are walking into a held position. Silence. Outside the ship, the debris field drifted slowly, indifferent to the plans being layered across it. Daxrel studied the grid again. Even if they commit the full Vanguard, they still outmass us 10-1 in local firepower. Priya didn't look away from the map. In open space, she agreed. Mara narrowed her eyes. But not here. Priya nodded once. Not here. Vorn stepped closer to the projection. This is not a fleet engagement, he said. It is a guided collapse. That phrase changed the room. Daxrel frowned. Explain. Priya gestured toward the debris field. The Bravak's advance depends on formation integrity, she said. Their ships are strongest when their firing lanes overlap in predictable geometry. She zoomed in. Here, their geometry breaks. The hologram shifted. Lines of fire became jagged. Vectors intersected unstable debris clusters. Sensors flickered as interference zones overlapped. They lose synchronization, Priya continued. Their command structure compensates by tightening formation. Mara understood immediately. And tightening formation reduces maneuverability. Priya nodded. Which increases predictability. Daxrel's expression changed slightly. So they trap themselves. Vorn answered quietly. We give them no alternative. A long silence followed. Then Mara spoke. What's the bait? No one answered immediately. Because this was the most dangerous part of the plan. Priya finally did. We are, she said. Daxrel blinked. All 14 ships? Yes. Mara shook her head slightly. That's not bait. That's exposure. Priya looked at her. That's the point. Vorn nodded. They believe we are remnants, he said. We behave like remnants. Daxrel frowned. And when they realize we're coordinated? Mara answered before Vorn could. By then they're already inside the field. Silence tightened again. The map updated. The Bravak's vanguard was entering the outer shelf boundary. Sensors confirmed acceleration. No hesitation. No caution. Confidence. Priya watched carefully. They're not scanning aggressively. Vorn nodded. They don't think they need to. That was the second key layer. Arrogance. Not emotional arrogance. Structural arrogance. A civilization that had never been forced to question its own projection of dominance. Mara crossed her arms. They've never encountered resistance that didn't collapse under numerical superiority. Daxrel added quietly, until now. Priya zoomed in again. We initiate phase 1 when they cross marker grid sigma 3. Vorn nodded. Ridge trigger. Mara frowned. That's the outermost wreck cluster. Yes, Priya said. And it's the most visible, Daxrel added. Correct, she said. Mara's eyes narrowed. So we make them see us first at maximum distance. Priya nodded. We make them think they've located the entire threat. Daxrel slowly understood. And they commit deeper. Priya didn't respond. Because she didn't need to. Vorn stepped forward again. Once they commit, he said, we collapse their forward formation using staggered strike interference. Mara looked at him. Staggered? Priya answered. Each ship fires independently, but time to disrupt their sensor recalibration cycles. Daxrel frowned. You're weaponizing their sensor recovery delay. Yes. A pause. Mara exhaled slowly. That means no unified attack wave. Priya nodded. We don't attack as a fleet. Vorn completed the thought. We attack as an environment. That line hit harder than anything before it. Because it reframed the entire battlefield. Not ships versus ships. Not fleet versus fleet. But system versus perception. Daxrel looked at the projection again. This still hinges on them advancing into full engagement range. Mara nodded. And staying long enough for collapse. Priya zoomed out slightly. They will, she said. No hesitation. Daxrel frowned. You're certain? Priya finally looked at him. I studied their previous engagement doctrine, she said. They don't disengage when uncertain. They escalate until certainty returns. A pause. Mara finished it quietly. So we make certainty impossible. Priya nodded once. Exactly. Outside, the Bravak's vanguard crossed into Sigma 3 boundary. The first human ship activated passive signature reflection. Not firing. Not attacking. Just revealing presence. A signal. A bait pulse. Mara watched the display closely. First contact initiated. Vorn nodded. Let it begin. On the far edge of the debris field, Bravak's sensors locked onto the signal. 32 ships adjusted trajectory. Slightly. Then decisively. They committed inward. Daxrel watched the movement. They took the bait instantly. Priya's voice was quiet. They always do. Mara exhaled slowly. They think this is a cleanup. Vorn corrected her softly. They think this is already over. A pause. Then, that is the most dangerous assumption in war. The Bravak's formation entered deeper into the shelf. Debris density increased. Sensor noise intensified. Formation spacing tightened unconsciously. Exactly as predicted. Priya watched the pattern evolve. Phase 2 begins in 11 seconds. Mara nodded. Trigger ships ready. Vorn didn't speak. He just watched. The first human ship fired. Not at the vanguard. but into the debris field itself. A controlled fragmentation strike. A disruption pulse. The impact didn't destroy enemies. It destroyed certainty. Sensors scrambled. Return signals fractured. Bravac's formation adjusted. And in that adjustment, they became predictable. Priya whispered, almost to herself. There it is. Mara looked at her. There what is? Priya didn't take her eyes off the map. The moment they stopped being adaptive, she said. Daxrel frowned. That's impossible. They're an advanced Dominion force. Priya shook her head. No, she said. They are a system reacting to confusion. Vorn finally spoke. And we are going to keep them confused. Outside the bridge, the debris field continued drifting. Silent. Broken. Patient. Waiting for the war to be shaped inside it. And now, the Bravac's vanguard was fully inside. The trap was no longer being prepared. It had already closed around them. The moment the Bravac's vanguard opened fire, the Heron shelf stopped being a silent graveyard. It became alive. Not with noise. With consequences. On the bridge of the UES Vindicator, Captain Elias Vorn watched the first engagement bloom across the holographic field like a violent equation solving itself in real time. Lieutenant Mara Keel's voice cut through the silence immediately. Contact confirmed. Bravac's forward vanguard engaging ridge marker decoy ship. Priyakes didn't blink. Exactly as projected. Daxrel leaned forward. They're committing full forward battery fire on a single contact point. Vorn nodded once. That means they believe it's a clean target. A pause. Then Mara's voice tightened. Correction, ridge marker ship is returning fire. The hologram updated instantly. One human ship. Surrounded by 32 Bravac's vanguard vessels. And yet, it was not retreating. It was moving. Not away. Through. The debris field lit up as the first coordinated strike from the human side detonated inside a cluster of wrecked mining stations. The explosion wasn't large in raw energy terms, but it was precise. Too precise. Debris shifted. Sensor returns fractured. Bravac's targeting systems recalibrated. And for the first time in this engagement, the Vanguard lost lock stability. Mara stared at the display. They're disrupting sensor coherence already. Priya nodded sharply. Phase 1 successful. Daxrel frowned. That was only one ship. Priya didn't look away. That's enough. Because that was the second truth of the trap. They weren't fighting numbers. They were fighting structure. And structure only needed a crack. Outside the Vindicator, the debris field responded like a disturbed ecosystem. Fragments of destroyed hulls rotated into new vectors. Ionized dust clouds thickened under weapon discharge interference. Long-range scanning degraded into fragmented ghost signals. The Bravac's vanguard adjusted formation instinctively. Tightening. Condensing. Reinforcing firing lanes. Exactly as Priya predicted. Mara's eyes narrowed. They're compressing. Yes, Priya said. Daxrel exhaled. That increases their fire density, but reduces maneuvering space. Vorn stepped closer to the projection. And increases their predictability. A second human ship activated. Not firing. Relocating. Dragging Bravac's sensor focus across a drifting wreck cluster like a deliberate distraction. Then a third ship fired. Not at the enemy. At the field itself. The debris responded violently. Mass shadows shifted. Gravitational microeddies distorted targeting grids. And suddenly, Bravac's forward gunners lost alignment on 3 separate targets simultaneously. Mara spoke quickly. They're losing synchronized fire discipline. Priya nodded. Now it becomes reactionary. Daxrel frowned. Reactionary still means overwhelming force. Vorn answered quietly. Not in here. The hologram tightened as the battle space compressed into overlapping chaos zones. Bravac's ships tried to re-establish formation integrity. But every attempt to stabilize created new openings in their defensive coverage. Every correction introduced new error margins. And every error margin was exploited instantly. Mara's voice dropped slightly. They're not engaging a fleet. Priya finished it. They're engaging a system that refuses to stabilize. A pause. Then Daxrel spoke, slower now. This is not conventional warfare. Vorn didn't take his eyes off the map. No, he said. This is forced uncertainty. On the outer edge of the engagement, Bravac's command issued its first recalibration directive. The holographic projection flagged it instantly. Bravac's tactical update, unknown engagement complexity detected. Reevaluating threat classification. Mara read it twice. They're uncertain. Priya nodded once. That's the first failure state. Daxrel frowned. Uncertainty is not failure. Priya looked at him. In their doctrine it is. Silence tightened again. Because that was the core inversion. The Bravax Dominion had never built tactical frameworks for ambiguity. Their entire expansion strategy depended on certainty. Overwhelm, suppress, assimilate, erase. But here, certainty was collapsing. Vorn spoke quietly. Phase 2 is activating. On cue, for human ships repositioned simultaneously. Not in formation. Not in coordinated wave. But in distributed asymmetric arcs through debris corridors. Each movement deliberately broken from predictable vector logic. Bravax targeting systems attempted recalculation. Failed. Recalculated again. Failed faster. Mara watched closely. They're chasing ghosts. Priya corrected her immediately. No, she said. They're chasing response patterns that don't repeat. Daxrel frowned. That should be impossible under combat constraint systems. Priya finally looked at him. That's the point of the design. On the tactical display, Bravax formation began to fragment slightly. Not retreating. Not breaking. But separating into micro-engagement clusters as command cohesion struggled to maintain synchronized targeting authority. Mara noticed immediately. They're decentralizing fire control. Vorn nodded once. They are adapting. A pause. Then Priya added softly. Too slowly. Because adaptation required time. And time in this field was being actively denied. A Bravax heavy escort vessel attempted to stabilize a firing corridor through a debris channel. It succeeded. For exactly 4.3 seconds. Then a human strike pattern, previously hidden behind interference masking, detonated inside the corridor's exit vector. The firing lane collapsed. The escort vessel drifted off alignment. And the rest of the formation behind it lost synchronized angle coverage. Mara's voice sharpened. That wasn't random. Priya shook her head. No, she said. It was predicted. Daxrel stared at the map. They're anticipating movement before it happens. Priya corrected him again. No, she said. We're shaping movement until only one outcome remains viable. Vorn finally spoke. That's the trap. Silence followed. Because now it was visible. Not just a battle. A funnel. A controlled narrowing of possibility space. The Bravax vanguard pushed deeper into the shelf, attempting to restore dominance through force escalation. They increased fire output. Expanded sensor sweeps. Committed auxiliary escort wings. And in doing so, they entered deeper into interference density. Every escalation reduced their coherence. Every correction reduced their stability. And every loss of stability increased reliance on command prediction systems that were now failing under environmental noise. Mara whispered. They're overcommitting. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel looked uneasy. They still outgun us massively. Vorn answered without hesitation. Individually. A pause. Not structurally. On the far edge of the battlefield, a Bravax command vessel attempted a formation reset. The maneuver required synchronized repositioning of 6 escort clusters. 2 failed to respond correctly due to sensor lag. 1 responded late. The formation reset failed. And for the first time, the Bravax vanguard had to pause internal correction cycles mid-engagement. That pause lasted less than 2 seconds. But in that space, human ships moved. Not together. Not as a wave. As independent fractures across the field. And each fracture struck a different point of instability. Mara's voice lowered. They're bleeding coordination time. Priya nodded. That's all we need. Daxrel finally understood. You're not trying to outfight them. Priya looked at him. No. We're trying to outdecide them. Silence. Then Vorn spoke quietly. And they are not used to being second in decision speed. The Bravax command issued another recalibration order. This one carried subtle urgency markers. Mara read it instantly. They flagged us as non-standard engagement. Priya nodded once. First doctrinal exception. Daxrel frowned. That means escalation protocols. Yes, Priya said. Vorn added quietly. And escalation takes time. Outside the ship, the debris field continued its slow drift. But inside it, war was no longer symmetrical. It was no longer even understandable under standard Dominion frameworks. The Bravax vanguard had entered expecting cleanup. They had found resistance. Not in force, but in structure. And structure that refused to stabilize. Mara looked at the map again. The Bravax formation was still intact. Still dangerous. Still superior in firepower. But now, it was hesitating between actions. And hesitation in combat doctrine systems designed for certainty was not neutral. It was decay. Priya whispered softly. They're starting to feel it. Daxrel frowned. Feel what? Priya didn't answer immediately. Then she said, That they are not in control of the tempo anymore. Vorn looked at the map. And for the first time in the engagement, he allowed himself a single thought. Not hope. Not victory. Just confirmation. The trap had closed. And the enemy had noticed. Too late to leave. Not yet able to understand why staying was becoming dangerous. The Heron Shelf did not explode into victory or collapse into defeat. It settled into something far worse. A grind. On the bridge of the UES Vindicator, the tactical display no longer looked like a battle map. It looked like a wound that refused to close. Lieutenant Mara Keel's voice had gone quieter, but sharper. Engagement duration, 3 hours 14 minutes and increasing. Priya Kess didn't look up from her console. Breath Vanguard has fully committed secondary escorts into the shelf. Dax Rel wiped sweat from his brow without realizing it. They're reinforcing mid-engagement. Vorn's eyes stayed fixed on the projection. That means they still believe they can stabilize the situation. Mara hesitated. Or they refuse to accept instability. Priya corrected her immediately. In their doctrine, those are the same thing. Outside, the battlefield had evolved into layers. Not lines. Not formations. Layers of overlapping chaos. Human ships moved like fragments of a broken algorithm, never repeating patterns, never holding position long enough to be predicted, always slipping through debris corridors that turned sensor locks into noise. The Bravax Vanguard adapted. Slowly. Too slowly. But they adapted. Their firepower increased. Their formation density tightened. Their engagement coverage expanded. And yet, they could not stop the fragmentation. Dax Rel leaned forward. They've increased total ship count in the engagement zone by 40%. Priya nodded. And reduced effective coordination efficiency by 22%. Mara looked at her. That shouldn't happen. Priya didn't blink. It does when the environment fights back. Silence followed that statement. Because it reframed everything again. Not fleet versus fleet. Not even trap versus prey. But system versus entropy. And entropy was winning time. On the far edge of the field, a Bravax cruiser took sustained fire from 3 human ships operating in non-overlapping attack windows. It returned fire. Missed. Adjusted targeting. Missed again. Adjusted again. And then overcorrected. Its main weapon discharge struck debris instead of target vector. The explosion disrupted its own sensor array. Mara watched closely. They're degrading under self-correction pressure. Priya nodded once. Every correction creates noise. Noise accumulates. Dax Rel frowned. That's psychological warfare? Priya shook her head. No. This is mathematical exhaustion. Vorn finally spoke. They are running out of certainty cycles. A pause. Then Mara asked quietly. And what does that mean for them? Priya answered without hesitation. It means they start wasting time deciding instead of acting. On cue, another Bravax formation cluster hesitated mid-advance. Not retreating. Not attacking. Just recalculating entry vectors that no longer aligned cleanly with sensor data. And in that hesitation, 2 human ships repositioned and struck simultaneously from opposite debris corridors. The Bravax cluster fractured. Not destroyed. But disrupted. And disruption, in this environment, was worse than damage. Dax Rel exhaled slowly. They're bleeding coordination. Priya nodded. They are now in recursive decision loops. Mara frowned. Explain. Priya finally looked at her. They attempt to stabilize formation, she said. But every stabilization attempt changes sensor interpretation. Dax Rel understood immediately. So stabilization creates instability. Yes. Vorn added quietly. And instability forces stabilization. A pause. The loop continues. Mara whispered, until collapse? Priya answered. Until exhaustion. The word changed the room. Because exhaustion was not a weapon in most doctrines. It was a consequence. But here, it was strategy. Outside, the Bravax fleet began rotating command responsibility between subunits to reduce decision latency strain. But that introduced new communication delays. New synchronization gaps. New fragmentation points. Human ships exploited every gap. Not with overwhelming force. But with timing precision. Perfectly delayed strikes. Perfectly offset engagements. Perfectly asymmetrical pressure. Dax Rel shook his head slightly. They're not even giving them time to recover between engagements. Priya nodded. That's intentional. Mara glanced at Vorn. How long can we sustain this? The question hung. Because no one liked the answer. Vorn finally said. Long enough for them to believe they cannot. Silence. That was the real target. Not destruction. Not territorial denial. Belief collapse. On the tactical display, Bravac's command initiated a mid-battle doctrine shift. Mara flagged it instantly. They're switching from forward dominance protocol to containment suppression strategy. Priya nodded once. That's their second-tier response. Daxrel frowned. Meaning? They've accepted they cannot cleanly overwhelm, Priya said. So now they attempt to contain and isolate. Vorn added quietly. Containment requires stable perimeter control. Mara's eyes narrowed. Which they don't have here. Priya nodded. Exactly. The containment strategy failed within 11 minutes of deployment. Because there was no stable perimeter. Only shifting debris, unpredictable movement corridors, and human ships that refused positional logic. The Bravac's formation began showing the first signs of systemic strain. Not losses. Not destruction. But hesitation accumulation. Every unit waiting slightly longer before committing fire. Every escort recalculating slightly more often. Every command relay introducing slight delay. And those slights stacked. Daxrel noticed first. Their reaction time is increasing. Priya nodded. Cognitive load saturation. Mara blinked. On machines? Priya answered quietly. On systems designed to behave like certainty engines. Vorn watched the projection. They are not failing in combat, he said. They are failing in interpretation. Outside, a Bravac's heavy carrier attempted to force a corridor breakthrough. It committed full forward momentum. Human ships immediately repositioned. Not to stop it directly, but to deny its ability to stabilize firing geometry. The carrier fired anyway. Missed its primary target. Hit debris. Triggered secondary interference field. And in that interference, 3 more Bravac's ships lost synchronized targeting lock. Mara's voice tightened. That carrier just destabilized its own wing. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel looked uneasy. They're getting worse at coordinating under pressure. Priya corrected him. They are getting worse at predicting under non-ideal conditions. A pause. That is the only condition we give them. Hours passed. The battle did not progress. It thickened. Like pressure building in a sealed chamber. Both sides still fought. Both sides still inflicted damage. But the nature of damage shifted. Breath Dominion forces inflicted structural damage. Human forces inflicted systemic disruption. And systemic disruption was harder to recover from. Mara rubbed her eyes. We've been engaged for almost 9 hours. Priya nodded. And they are still entering deeper. Daxrel frowned. They should have stopped pushing by now. Vorn answered quietly. They have not yet reached their internal threshold of unacceptable uncertainty. Mara looked at him. And when they do? Vorn paused. Then they will begin to break doctrine. Silence again. Because doctrine breaking meant something fundamental. A civilization realizing its assumptions no longer applied. On the battlefield, Bravac's command issued a high-priority stabilization directive. Mara read it immediately. They're attempting full formation lock. Priya shook her head. It will fail. Daxrel frowned. Why? Priya looked at the projection. Because nothing in this field is stable long enough to lock onto. As if confirming her statement. A human strike wave passed through a debris corridor at precisely the wrong moment for Bravac's targeting systems. The lock attempt failed. And the Bravac's formation desynchronized again. This time more severely. Mara went quiet. They're losing coherence. Priya nodded. Slowly. Vorn added. But irreversibly. On the far edge of the field, Bravac's command issued a recalibration message marked with urgency flags not previously seen. Mara read it twice. They're requesting external doctrinal guidance. Daxrel blinked. From Central Command? Yes. Priya exhaled slowly. That means they no longer trust internal adaptation. Vorn nodded once. That is the first real crack. Outside, the Heron Shelf continued to burn quietly. Not in destruction. But in sustained, grinding impossibility. Human ships kept moving. Breath ships kept reacting. And somewhere between them, time itself was becoming a weapon. Mara whispered without looking away from the display. They're starting to feel like they're losing even when they win exchanges. Priya nodded. That's the objective. Daxrel finally asked the question that had been building for hours. When does it end? Vorn looked at the map. At the fractured formations. At the collapsing symmetry. At the system failing to stabilize. And he said? When they stop believing the next correction will work. The Bravac's Dominion had never experienced hesitation as an enemy force. Only resistance. Only annihilation. Only delay before inevitable collapse. But on the Heron Shelf, inevitability was no longer behaving correctly. On the bridge of the UES Vindicator, the tactical display flickered under continuous recalibration strain. Lieutenant Mara Keel's voice had changed again. Not quieter this time. Tighter. Bravac's command network showing instability across 3 hierarchical layers. Priya Kess leaned in immediately. Show me the fragmentation map. The hologram shifted. What had once been a unified command structure now appeared as overlapping decision clusters, some synchronized, some delayed, some actively contradicting each other. Daxrel stared. They're not coordinating anymore. Priya nodded once. They're arguing. Mara blinked. Machines don't argue. Priya didn't look away. They do when their shared model of reality stops matching incoming data. Vorn's gaze remained fixed. It is not argument, he said. It is doctrinal conflict resolution failure. A pause. Then Mara added quietly. Translation? Priya answered. Their commanders no longer agree on what is happening. Silence tightened across the bridge. Because that was not supposed to happen. Bravac's doctrine was not flexible belief, it was rigid execution hierarchy. Orders flowed downward. Interpretation did not exist. But now, interpretation was unavoidable. Because the battlefield no longer fit any known Bravac's classification. On the outer shelf, a Bravac's cruiser attempted a full sector stabilization order. The command signal propagated. Half the formation responded immediately. A quarter responded late. The rest did not respond at all. Mara flagged it instantly. They're splitting command authority mid-engagement. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel frowned. That's a collapse behavior. Priya corrected him softly. It's a survival behavior. Vorn added. When centralized certainty fails, systems fragment to preserve partial functionality. A pause. And fragmentation reduces efficiency. Mara watched the tactical map carefully. What are they fragmenting into? Priya zoomed in. Local command autonomy clusters. Daxrel shook his head. That's just decentralization. Priya looked at him. No, she said. That's panic disguised as adaptation. Outside the Vindicator, the battlefield shifted again. A Bravac's battle group attempted a synchronized push into the midshelf corridor. For 12 seconds, it worked. Then a human interference strike disrupted their sensor synchronization window. One ship responded late. Another responded early. A third misidentified target vector entirely. The formation broke. Not violently. Not catastrophically. But structurally. Mara whispered, that's the 4th formation collapse in under an hour. Priya nodded. And each one increases command uncertainty. Daxrel frowned. Why are they still pushing forward? Vorn answered quietly. Because their doctrine does not contain a retreat instruction for incomplete dominant states. Silence. That was the true fracture point. Not loss of ships. Not battlefield confusion. But absence of doctrine for partial failure. Bravac's command systems had been built on binary outcomes. Victory proceed. Resistance escalate. Collapse erase. But here, there was no collapse. Only sustained resistance without decay. And escalation no longer guaranteed stabilization. On the tactical display, Bravac's High Command issued a priority override directive. Mara read it instantly. They're bypassing regional commanders. Priya's expression sharpened. Central Command is taking direct control. Daxrel exhaled slowly. That usually means desperation. Priya nodded. It means the system no longer trusts itself. Vorn spoke quietly. And when a system stops trusting itself, it overcorrects. As if on cue, the Bravac's fleet executed a full-spectrum energy saturation sweep across the midshelf. It was massive, overwhelming, and completely inefficient. The sweep struck debris clusters, empty corridors, and already cleared vectors. Only a fraction of energy impacted active human positions. Mara's eyes widened. They wasted massive output. Priya nodded once. Reaction without intelligence filtering. Daxrel frowned. They're firing blind. Priya corrected him. They're firing to feel control. A pause. That's different. On the far edge of the engagement zone, 3 Bravac's escorts collided mid-maneuver correction. Not due to damage. Not due to fire. But due to contradictory command inputs. Mara watched closely. They just crashed their own formation. Priya nodded. Yes. Vorn added quietly. Doctrinal conflict is now causing physical failure. Silence. Because that was the moment where war stopped being tactical. And became systemic decay. The Bravac's command network issued a stabilization emergency protocol. But this time, it propagated slowly. Too slowly. Because each layer of command was now validating instructions against conflicting interpretations of battlefield reality. Mara whispered, they're hesitating before executing orders. Priya nodded. That's new. Daxrel frowned. Why is that new? Priya looked at him. Because until now, orders were truth. A pause. Now they are hypotheses. Vorn watched the map carefully. They are no longer executing doctrine, he said. They are testing it. That was the breaking point. Because doctrine is only powerful when unquestioned. On the battlefield, Bravak's command attempted to isolate human fleet coordination nodes. But human coordination did not exist in the same form. No central node. No single command hub vulnerability. Only distributed autonomous execution patterns. Priya had designed it that way. Daxrel finally understood. They can't decapitate command because there isn't one. Priya nodded. Yes. Mara exhaled slowly. So they're trying to kill something that doesn't exist. Priya corrected her. They're trying to restore a model that no longer applies. Outside, Bravak's fleet cohesion dropped below 68%. Then 61. Then 54. Not from losses. From coordination breakdown. Mara's voice tightened. They're approaching internal fragmentation threshold. Priya nodded. And they know it. Daxrel frowned. What happens when they hit it? Vorn answered without hesitation. They begin issuing contradictory survival directives. Silence. Because contradictory survival directives meant something simple and catastrophic. A fleet fighting itself. On the tactical display, Bravaks. Daxrel stared at the screen. And now? Vorn looked at the battlefield. At the fragments. At the noise. At the absence of unity. And he said? Now it ends slowly. The Bravaks Dominion had never been forced to retreat as a unified force. They did not retreat. They erased. They advanced until opposition ceased to matter. But on the Heron Shelf, something unfamiliar was spreading through their command network. Not defeat. Not destruction. Something far more corrosive. Uncertainty with direction. On the bridge of the UES Vindicator, the tactical display no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a system trying to escape itself. Lieutenant Mara Keel's voice was steady now, but lower. Bravak's fleet cohesion has dropped to 41%. Priya Kes didn't react immediately. Show me movement vectors. The hologram updated. And what appeared made Daxrel go quiet. Because the Bravak's formation was no longer a formation. It was drift. Clusters of ships peeling away from engagement zones. Not all at once. Not cleanly. But continuously. Like a structure losing structural integrity one beam at a time. Mara frowned. They're withdrawing from multiple sub-engagement zones simultaneously. Priya nodded once. Yes. Daxrel leaned forward. That's not tactical repositioning. Priya corrected him. It's escape behavior. A pause. Mara whispered, but they still outnumber every local cluster. Priya looked at her. Numbers don't matter when command coherence is gone. Vorn's gaze stayed fixed on the projection. Collapse has reached propagation phase. Mara blinked. Propagation? Priya answered. It spreads. And it was spreading. Across the Bravak's fleet, command nodes were now transmitting contradictory status reports. Engaged successfully. Unable to stabilize target lock. Local dominance achieved. Retreat advisable. Each message traveled through overlapping layers of degraded synchronization. Each layer introduced delay. Each delay introduced distortion. And distortion became interpretation failure. Daxrel frowned. They're reporting completely different realities. Priya nodded. Yes. Vorn added quietly. Reality divergence inside a command network is terminal. A pause. Because now it was no longer just fragmentation. It was belief separation. On the tactical field, a Bravak's heavy escort cluster attempted to regroup around a damaged command vessel. For 90 seconds, it succeeded. Then a human strike wave hit the outer debris boundary, not targeting the cluster directly, but collapsing the sensor geometry around it. The escort cluster misinterpreted the strike as a full-scale encirclement. Panic response triggered. Half the cluster broke formation instantly. Mara watched closely. They're overreacting to partial data again. Priya nodded. That's now default behavior. Daxrel shook his head slowly. They're seeing threats that aren't fully there. Priya corrected him. They are filling missing information with worst-case assumptions. Vorn added quietly. And worst-case assumptions multiply under stress. Outside, Bravak's fleet segments began executing independent withdrawal patterns. Not coordinated. Not authorized. Local commanders were now prioritizing survivability over engagement continuity. Mara's voice tightened. That's full fragmentation. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel exhaled. So it's over? Priya didn't answer immediately. Then she said, it is no longer one battle. Vorn completed it. It is many exits happening at once. A pause. And that was the truth. The Bravax Dominion fleet was not being destroyed. It was dispersing. Breaking into survival fragments. Each fragment operating under its own degraded interpretation of reality. Some believed they were still winning localized engagements. Some believed they were surrounded. Some believed withdrawal was strategic repositioning. And some were simply running. On the tactical display, a Bravax command cruiser attempted to restore order by broadcasting a full-spectrum fleet cohesion signal. It was the final centralized attempt. The signal propagated across the shelf. And for a moment, it worked. Mara leaned forward. They're stabilizing for a second. Priya narrowed her eyes. No. Daxrel frowned. What do you mean no? Priya pointed at the projection. That signal contradicts prior survival directives. A pause. Watch. And then it happened. Within seconds of receiving the cohesion broadcast, 3 Bravax subclusters reversed direction. 2 continued withdrawal. 1 stopped entirely and began defensive posturing against both perceived enemies and allied units. Mara's eyes widened. They just split again. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel stared. So unity is impossible now? Priya answered quietly. Unity requires shared interpretation. Vorn added. And they no longer share anything. On the far edge of the battlefield, human ships did not chase. They did not pursue. They simply held position within the debris field, maintaining pressure without acceleration. That restraint mattered. Because pursuit would have restored enemy cohesion through shared external focus. Instead, they let fragmentation continue. Mara noticed it. We're not chasing them. Priya nodded. We don't need to. Daxrel frowned. But they're escaping. Priya looked at him. No, she said. They're dissolving. Outside, Bravax fleet casualties increased, not from combat strikes, but from navigational failures during uncontrolled withdrawal. Ships collided in debris corridors. Escort vessels misidentified allies as threats under degraded sensor overlap. Command relays misrouted evacuation orders into combat zones. The system was collapsing under its own noise. Mara whispered, they can't even leave cleanly. Priya nodded once. No structured exit is possible anymore. Vorn's voice was quiet. Because structured behavior requires coherence. A pause. And coherence is gone. Daxrel looked at the map again. The Bravax formation was no longer a formation. It was scattering points. Moving outward. Away from the shelf. Away from each other. Away from command authority. Mara spoke softly. It's like watching a system forget how to be itself. Priya answered. That is exactly what it is. On the tactical display, Bravax High Command issued one final directive. Not tactical. Not operational. Psychological. All units prioritize survival and return to safe vector space. Mara read it twice. That's a full doctrine abandonment. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel exhaled slowly. They gave up control. Priya corrected him. They acknowledged they cannot maintain it. Vorn looked at the projection. And that acknowledgement spreads faster than orders. Because once survival becomes individual instead of collective, hierarchy dissolves. On the battlefield, Bravax ships began exiting engagement zones at increasing velocity. Not coordinated withdrawal. Not tactical retreat. Escape acceleration. Mara watched carefully. They're leaving in waves now. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel frowned. Why waves? Priya answered. Because waves are what happens when independent decisions align only statistically. A pause. And not structurally. Vorn added quietly. They are no longer a fleet. Mara whispered, what are they now? Priya looked at the display. A population of ships reacting to shared trauma. Silence. That sentence changed the emotional weight of everything. Because it was no longer war between forces. It was collapse between systems. On the outer edge of the shelf, the last Bravax coordinated group attempted to regroup. It failed within minutes. Not due to fire. Not due to interception. But due to internal contradiction between retreat directives and local command inertia. The group fractured into 3 separate escape vectors. Mara exhaled slowly. That's it. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel asked quietly, is there anything left of their command structure? Vorn looked at the map for a long moment. Then he said, only memory of it. And memory was not enough to hold a fleet together. Outside the UES Vindicator, the Heron shelf remained scarred, broken, and silent again. But the silence was different now. It was not waiting. It was aftermath. And the Bravax Dominion fleet was no longer holding the line. It was running from the idea that the line had ever existed. The Heron Shelf did not celebrate immediately. At first, there was only silence. Not the silence of absence. The silence of disbelief. On the bridge of the UES Vindicator, Captain Elias Vorn stood motionless as the tactical display finally stabilized into something that no longer resembled a battlefield. Lieutenant Mara Keel spoke first, but her voice sounded distant, as if she was hearing herself from another ship. Bravac's fleet signatures confirmed retreat beyond engagement boundary. A pause. Then she added, "No active hostile formations remain within the shelf." Priya Kess didn't react immediately. She was still watching the last drifting signal clusters fade from the map. Dax Rel exhaled slowly. "They're gone. Not destroyed. Not annihilated. Gone." Vorn finally spoke. "For the first time," he said quietly, "they chose distance over dominance." That sentence carried more weight than any victory report. Because it described a shift in nature, not numbers. Outside the viewport, the Heron Shelf drifted in fractured stillness. Wreckage spun slowly through ionized dust fields. Burned hulls reflected distant starlight like broken glass scattered across infinity. But the enemy presence was no longer pressing inward. It was withdrawing outward at scale never previously observed in Bravac's doctrine history. Mara checked the long-range feed again. "They are continuing to retreat in subclusters." Priya nodded once. "Yes." Dax Rel frowned. "Will they regroup?" Priya didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Not in the same configuration." That was the first true consequence. Not defeat. Not loss. But irreversible structural change. On the Bravac's command channel, fragmented transmissions still leaked through intercepted corridors. No longer coordinated doctrine. No longer unified command language. Just broken reports. Contact cannot be stabilized, human engagement patterns remain nonlinear, fleet cohesion failure persists beyond correction thresholds, recommend avoidance of sustained engagement zones. Mara listened to the decoded fragments. Then whispered, "They're describing us like a natural disaster." Priya corrected her softly. "No. Like an unknown physical law." A long pause filled the bridge. Because that distinction mattered. Natural disasters could be studied. Unknown laws had to be adapted around. Vorn stepped closer to the projection. The Bravac's Dominion has never recorded a non-collapsible enemy engagement before. Dax Rel frowned. "So this changes their doctrine permanently?" Vorn nodded once. "Yes." Mara looked up. "In what way?" Priya answered quietly. "They will no longer assume withdrawal means defeat." A pause. "They will no longer assume numbers guarantee control." Dax Rel added slowly. "And they will no longer assume certainty exists in combat." Vorn's gaze stayed fixed on the drifting field. "They will rewrite their entire engagement philosophy." Silence followed. Because that meant this battle did not end here. It propagated. Not through space. Through thought. On the far edge of the system, surviving Bravac's command vessels began transmitting long-range doctrinal correction signals back toward core space. Not victory reports. Not tactical summaries. Warnings. Mara read one aloud quietly. "Engagement with human fleet results in sustained systemic destabilization under all tested conditions." Priya nodded. "That will be archived." Dax Rel frowned. "Archived?" Priya looked at him. "Yes." And studied. A pause. And feared. Outside the Vindicator, the first Allied ships began emerging from holding position at waypoint convergence. Not cautiously. Not hesitantly. But deliberately. The Sarthi High Marshal's battle group arrived first, formation intact, weapons cold but ready. Then the line command vessels, scanning the debris field with cautious recalibration systems still processing the aftermath. Then smaller coalition fleets, drifting in like a delayed tide returning to shore. Mara watched them arrive. "They're actually coming back." Priya nodded once. "Yes." Dax Rel exhaled. They didn't believe the report until they saw it. Vorn answered quietly. "No one believes absence of collapse until they witness it directly." A pause. And even then, they struggle to interpret it. On the Allied command channel, fragmented discussions began forming. Not victory celebration. Interpretation struggle. Sarthi commanders requesting clarification on Bravac's withdrawal causality. The line analysts attempting to model engagement behavior against known probability frameworks. Draenei observers reporting emotional analogues for what they had witnessed but could not formally categorize. Mara listened to it all. "They don't know what to call this." Priya nodded. "Because nothing in their history prepares them for it." Dax Rel frowned. "So what do they call it?" Vorn answered quietly. "Humanity." Silence. That word changed the tone of the bridge. Because now it was no longer just a battle report. It was classification failure. On the tactical display, final Bravax signals crossed the retreat threshold and faded into deep space dispersion patterns. No pursuit was ordered. None was needed. Because pursuit implies continuation. And continuation no longer existed. Mara spoke softly. It's over. Priya corrected her gently. No. It has changed shape. Daxrel looked at her. What does that mean? Priya finally looked up. It means next time they will not enter the same way. A pause. They will hesitate before commitment. And hesitation changes everything. Vorn turned slightly toward the crew. This engagement will be studied as a failure of Bravax's certainty doctrine. Mara asked quietly. And for us? Vorn paused. Then said. It will be studied as proof that certainty is not required to survive. A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Transformational. Outside the viewport, the Heron shelf remained scarred, but now it was no longer active battlefield space. It was memory space. A place where something had happened that did not fit existing rules. Priya spoke finally, almost to herself. They came here expecting to erase us. Daxrel nodded slowly. And left unable to define us. Vorn added quietly. That is the only kind of victory that changes civilizations. On distant Bravax core channels, the first strategic reassessment protocols were already being initiated. Not retaliation planning. Not expansion correction. But constraint modeling. Human engagement zones marked as high uncertainty dominance environment, nonlinear threat behavior classification, do not engage without full doctrinal revision. Mara read the classification feed as it appeared. Then whispered. They're afraid to label us normally. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel frowned. That's new for them. Priya corrected him. That's permanent for them. Vorn stepped back from the hologram. The battlefield was gone. Only aftermath remained. And in that aftermath? A new pattern had formed across every surviving intelligence network in the system. Not written. Not ordered. But understood. Mara looked at Vorn. So what happens now? Vorn was silent for a long moment. Then he answered. Now they remember. A pause. And act differently forever. Outside, the stars remained cold and distant. But the meaning of distance had changed. Because somewhere out there, the Bravax Dominion had learned something it had never encountered before. Not defeat. Not annihilation. Not even resistance. A species that did not break when the equation said it should. And that single realization would echo across civilizations for generations. Command issued 2 simultaneous orders. One to consolidate formation. One to expand dispersal range. Mara blinked. That's impossible. Priya nodded slowly. It is now happening. Daxrel stared. Which one do they follow? Priya answered softly. Whichever arrives first. A pause. And whichever is closer to the receiver's interpretation bias. Vorn added quietly. In other words, randomization. Outside, Bravax fleet behavior became visibly unstable. Some clusters tightened formation. Others dispersed aggressively. Others stopped moving entirely for brief recalibration cycles that no longer resolved consistently. Mara whispered, they're fragmenting into behavioral noise. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel looked unsettled. That's not a fleet anymore. Priya answered calmly. No. It's a system losing coherence under sustained contradiction. Vorn stepped closer to the projection. And contradiction is all we have given them. A pause. The battlefield shifted again. A Bravax command vessel attempted to restore centralized authority by broadcasting absolute override frequency control. But the signal conflicted with earlier regional directives. Half the fleet rejected it. Half partially accepted it. And the remaining ships oscillated between both states. Mara's voice dropped. They've lost unified command reception. Priya nodded once. That's doctrinal breakdown. Daxrel frowned. So now what do? Vorn answered quietly. Now they attempt emotional substitution. Mara blinked. What? Priya explained. When logic fails, systems fall back on dominance instincts. Daxrel understood immediately. Overkill responses. Priya nodded. Yes. On cue, Bravax ships began increasing weapon discharge frequency beyond optimal targeting thresholds. Not more accurate. Not more effective. Just more. Mara watched closely. They're escalating fire output without target stability. Priya nodded. That's panic expressed as volume. Vorn added quietly. And volume cannot restore coherence. Outside, the battlefield no longer resembled structured combat. It resembled overlapping breakdown states. Command confusion reaction fire sensor overload correction failure escalation further confusion. A loop. A collapse cycle. Mara whispered, they can't stabilize anything anymore. Priya nodded. They are past stabilization capacity. Daxrel looked at Vorn. So they're finished? Vorn did not answer immediately. Then he said, no. They are still dangerous. A pause. But no longer unified. That distinction mattered. Because unified danger is predictable. Fragmented danger is chaotic. And chaos was already spreading. On the tactical display, Bravac's command issued a final emergency doctrine broadcast. All units operate under local survival authority. Mara read it slowly. They just dissolved Central Command. Priya nodded. Yes. Daxrel exhaled. That's not strategy. Priya looked at him. No, she said. That's surrender disguised as continuity. Vorn watched the map. And for the first time since the engagement began, the Bravac's formation no longer behaved like a fleet. It behaved like isolated survival instincts scattered across a collapsing system. Mara whispered softly. They broke themselves. Priya nodded once. Yes.